Good evening all, and welcome to a night of spooks and spectres. I am fortunate enough to be joined by my artist Angeliki on screen, showing the process of drawing the artwork for this incredible thumbnail. And for an added bonus, she will also be narrating some ghostly tales this evening. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was 15, my mother bought her dream house, a large Victorian on a hill, with 7 bedrooms, and much larger than the tiny 1-bedroom that we'd been living in. During the buying period, we were there several times, and I was excited to get my own room, finally. Before we could move in though, a lot of cleaning needed to be done. The previous tenants had left it feet deep in crap, clothing, and loads of other stuff we had to clear out. We hadn't lived there for very long, and then the nightmares started. They were always about ghosts. I told my mother that I thought there were ghosts in the house. She scoffed and said, "All right, I'll have my sister come." Her sister was a sensitive, who could feel when spirits were present. She went through and declared it clear, but I insisted. Finally, just after New Year, we moved in. Soon after, it became apparent that I was right. Things started getting moved. You'd see things out of the corner of your eye, odd noises and smells. I'd smell whiskey in my bedroom, or chocolate cake in the kitchen. Turned out, there had been an older couple who lived there. She loved to bake, and he loved to drink, and when he had too much, his wife would make him sleep in another room, my room. Then there was the black cloud. It would follow me up the stairs at night, and stop as I went into my bedroom. As soon as the door would shut, it would come through the wall and drift in back and forth. At about this time, my depression deepened, and I began considering suicide. The old man seemed to be more attached to my sister, who will deny anything to this day, but she would suddenly begin sleeping in the living room. I finally saw him one night. I was going from my bedroom to the bathroom, and looked through the front bedroom towards her room. In the front of the door, facing it, was this pale figure of an old man, but his face was turned towards me. The black eye sockets were staring right at me. All of a sudden, I didn't need the bathroom anymore. I sat in my room trying to figure out what I had just seen. The main one, though, we called Victoria. We saw and experienced her the most. She was a tall woman, wearing a Victorian gown, hence the name. I was up early one morning. My mother had gotten up for work and looked up the stairs and saw my sister coming down. "Both of you up before dawn? What's going on?" She waited for my sister to come down into the kitchen, in her robe and hair up in a towel. She waited and waited. She finally started calling up the stairs. My sister finally answered, and my mother asked, "Weren't you just coming down the stairs?" "No, I was sleeping," she replied. Victoria would suddenly appear in the middle of a room, drifting through it and then disappear. I would hear my mother speaking in the kitchen. "What?" I'd ask, and there would be no reply. I was just talking to the ghost. One night, I was up late writing, and I went downstairs for a cup of tea. I came up the stairs and turned to go into my room, and just as I was doing so, I glanced into my sister's room, and that's when I saw him. The old man was just there, standing in the doorway. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring as he slowly faded from view. The Victorian ghost liked to take things as well, usually jewellery or underwear, but one day I had important papers from my car insurance laid out on the table in my room. I went to deal with them, and they were gone. There was no one else in the house. At first I thought a breeze may have swept them onto the floor, but they were nowhere to be seen. Things would often be returned, either the third time you looked where the item was left, or around the third day you lost them. Sure enough, 3 days later, the insurance papers were right back on the table where I put them, except they had been folded into quarters. Many years later, my neighbour's father passed away. I went with her to the funeral and the reception at the church. Relatives gathered afterwards at the house, where we were out on the back porch jabbering away. I'm listening to my family's stories, and one of her cousins pipes up. "Who the hell are you?" My neighbour explains who I am, and which house I live in. And she goes, "Oh, do you still have that tall lady ghost who stands by the window in the library?" I felt my blood turn cold. I didn't know anyone else who knew about her, let alone anyone else who called the room the library. It's actually a large walk-in closet with a window at the end, which faces the front of the house. There's a bookcase along one of the walls full of books, so our family just called it that. Little did we know, so did everyone else. I had a medicine man bless and clear the place, and those spirits are no more. But allegedly, there is a portal in the house, so things will come and go. Unfortunately, 11 years to the day of moving in, my mother lost her battle with cancer at 4:45 a.m. I was suddenly awakened, sat straight upright, and I smelt roses and felt someone standing in the doorway. "Mum, is that you?" Then I fell back asleep, my head hitting the pillow, out like a light. At 7:30 a.m, I was awoken from my sleep by a phone call from the nursing home, telling me that she had passed at night. I still live here. Though she visits me occasionally, she's never made good on her threat to haunt this place.
My wife and I recently moved out of a home that I can only describe as fucked up. The house caused so much anger and hatred. Whatever entity resides in the home is either menacing or pure evil. Even as soon as my wife moved into the home when she was a child, she told me a story of when her and her little brother were playing one night in his room. They were playing with a leapfrog-type device. She described in detail about how she was showing her brother how to use it and it began to act strange. Strange sounds came out of it, and then a man's voice began screaming from it. She said it was saying something about a list, something about making mistakes, screaming and cursing until she turned it off. So let's fast forward some. I met my wife a few years ago and needless to say she got knocked up. We decided that since it was the logical thing to do, I would move in with her. Sweet, no problem. At the time I worked the night shift, 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. This will come up later. After a few weeks of moving in, I noticed something strange about the house. The upstairs where we lived seemed menacing in a way, like someone was in the other room waiting for you. At first, I brushed it off as being nervous. New house, new life kind of thing. I also thought it was from the pretty much steady insomnia work was causing me. As time went on, I began noticing more and more. Whenever the house should have been dead silent, things would happen. Footsteps up and down the hallways, knocks on doors, and sometimes I could swear I heard whispers. Being an avid believer in spirits, I wasn't particularly afraid, until things started getting dark. One morning, as I was lying in bed watching Netflix and hoping to fall asleep, I heard a rustling from the closet. It was just light enough in the room that you could make everything out. I saw nothing and thought maybe it was just the fan. Something moved out of the corner of my eye, and as I looked at the closet, a dark ball moved from the closet to the bedroom door. It was about the size of a softball and moved about as fast as a person could to the door. Later into the week, my wife has gotten into the bad habit of sleeping with the closet light on. I blame myself for that one. Should have kept my mouth shut. So we're lying there talking about baby stuff, women, and I noticed that the curtain that covered the closet opening moved. My wife was curling to me facing my chest, and I was staring at the closet. As I kept watching, I saw what I can only describe as a tiny mist-like figure, not like white mist, but slightly darker than the rest of the background, moved out from the closet. It was maybe 3 feet tall and vanished as quick as it appeared. As soon as I began telling my wife what had happened, she had a sharp pinch on her back. She didn't cry out or scream. She calmly turned around and shouted, "Get the fuck out and leave us the fuck alone." Too bad it didn't work. Now let's fast forward. You are probably wondering what else happened. Well, small stuff here and there for a while. Footsteps were regular. And I know some of you are probably saying, "Is the house that lay down, jackass?" I would agree. But not only did the footsteps stretch out the entire length of the 20-foot hallway, they sometimes were fast. And the knocks on the doors were very rhythmic. You know, like when you knock on a friend's door when they are home or something. So let's get to scary stuff. After this recent Christmas, things began to spark up to a new level. One day I was sitting on my computer and my wife came into the room asking me what I needed from the store. The computer room was directly across from the bathroom. Our daughter's door was to the immediate left of that, and the stairs were to the right. I began telling my wife what I wanted when she looked at the door and turned, well, ghost white. Her eyes got big and her mouth dropped. She slowly turned toward me. I just saw a man walk into Elena's room. She begins describing what it looked like. It was about 6 feet tall, black, and only slightly translucent. While she's describing this, I walked out the hallway and go into my daughter's room. Have you ever walked into a freezer, like the ones Walmart stocks ice cream in? That immediate chill is what I felt when I walked in there. There was nothing, of course, but as soon as we began walking out, a set of metal bed frames we had laying against the wall, for over a year I might add, slid down and fell to the floor. My wife turned back into the room and told whatever it was to get the fuck out of our home. But it didn't, of course. Come January, things really picked up before we moved out. The power got knocked out during a sudden storm and we were left in the dark for a night. My wife at this point wanted nothing to do with the home, so she wanted to stay at her dad's. So we began packing her things for the night. I went downstairs and got my daughter loaded up in the car, and as I started walking back, my wife showed out the door nearly in tears. I asked her what was wrong, and she only said simply, "I don't want to talk. Close the door. Let's go." The upstairs to the home is pitch fucking black even on the brightest day due to the layout. So when the power's off during an overcast, you might as well be underground. My wife was in her room gathering her makeup and things with only a flashlight. As she was loading things into her bag, she heard someone walk from the stairs, down the hallway, and right back against her back. She assumed it was me, but when she turned around she saw nothing but black. Not like darkness black. Imagine someone holding a black sheet in front of you. Something like that. Even on our moving day, things were happening upstairs. It was the worst I've personally ever felt it. Just dread and sorrow. My wife once again had something walk up on her and heard knocks on the bedroom door while she was packing. We've got back a few times to get a thing or two since we left in February. Every time it's terrifying walking up the stairs. But I feel as if I should end this on a high note. We moved into a brand new home and it's a completely different experience here. It has helped our relationship and has taken a huge burden off of us.
This story happened when I was in my last year of college, wherein we had to make our thesis and defend it as a requirement for graduation. Me and two of my friends, John and May, planned to have an overnight stay at John's house to work on our thesis. After class, we went to each of our homes to get our things for overnight, our documents and the stuff we needed for the thesis. By 7 p.m, we were all in John's house, had our dinner, and then we began typing away. We were all doing great and came up with lots of ideas and codes for the output of our system. But by midnight, we started to feel fatigued. But none of us wanted to sleep yet. We were very much in the mood for just finishing the system we started, so we decided to tell some ghost stories to wake us up. John started and told us that sometimes in his room, in the same room that we are in now, he saw a ghostly figure standing by the corner of the room and just look at him. Me and May looked at each other. Then we began looking at every corner of the room. We both looked at each other again and laughed it off. We were not quite convinced of John's story, but from that we felt awake enough to continue with our system. We were working very hard, and at about 2:45, we felt sleepy again. But this time we wanted to rest by that time, so we tucked in and placed a cushion on the floor for us to sleep. We had our blanket on me, May, and then John. Just as we were all laying, May started scaring us, saying that there's someone creeping at the window, which I was closest to. John and I were not scared, and turned it against her, saying that she is also close to the window, so she can easily be reached by something outside. She got scared, stood up, and changed places with John. Now the arrangement is me, John, and May. May covered herself with a blanket, also covering her face, and then, one by one, we fell asleep. Here comes the frightening part. A few minutes later, I heard something scratching. I looked around, but there was nothing or no one there. Then I noticed that my body felt frozen. I tried moving my fingers and feet, but I seemed to be paralyzed. I tried speaking, but my mouth seemed like it was stitched together. I looked around and saw them both asleep, May still covered with the blanket. Then all of a sudden, May sat up, facing me, her whole body still being covered with a blanket. She then stood up in this weird way, stood up like she was a robot, slowly moving, and the blankets were still covering her. Then I noticed something horrifying. As I looked to my right side, I saw May at the corner end. She was still there, fast asleep. She never stood up, and her blanket was no longer covering her body. As a matter of fact, the blanket was no way near her. I started to realize that it wasn't May at all who had stood up. I started to freak out more, as I looked at the person or the thing covered by the blanket coming closer to me. I tried eagerly to move and scream, but to no use. It got much closer and closer, and I decided to close my eyes, and thought that maybe it would just go away. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes, and saw it just a few inches from my face, looking like it was ready to suck the life out of me. I tried to move and scream as powerfully as I could, and then I finally managed it. John woke up from my scream and tried to calm me down. I was not able to sleep again until the morning came. I told them that nightmare after we finished our thesis. for I didn't want to frighten them and get distracted by the supernatural thing that happened. I just said that I was never staying up that late again in that room.
This is an occurrence that happened when my oldest daughter Lila was almost 2 years old. Lila was always a happy yet needy baby. As long as she could see either myself or my husband Charles, she was the perfect child. But as soon as we were out of sight, she turned into a banshee until one of us came back into the room. That came to an end when we moved into my husband's grandmother's old house. Shortly after we moved in, I realized that she had started being okay with being left alone for short periods. I just figured that it was her, starting to gain a small bit of independence finally. The only way you would know she was awake in the mornings was the sound of soft giggles coming from the baby monitor. The stairs up to her room were as old as the house and made more noise than a bull in a china shop, so by the time you got to her room, she was always standing up in her bed with her arms raised in excitement, ready to be picked up. We always figured she was giggling at her stuffies or her newfound obsession with her toes. That was until I heard the strange voice coming from the monitor one night. My first thought was that we were picking up interference from a CD radio again, as it was an old monitor and it had happened before. It wasn't until I heard the voice say her name that I started to become concerned. I still wasn't rushing upstairs just yet because I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it. I sat there, stone still, almost not breathing, listening to the soft, barely audible voice coming from the monitor, trying to convince myself that it was just interference when I heard the voice saying, "You're such a pretty baby." I should mention that I was struggling with depression due to losing a child recently and was on lithium to combat it. I was trying to convince myself that it was an auditory hallucination caused by my medicine. I slowly climbed the stairs, wishing Charles hadn't chosen to cover someone's shift at work that night. I concentrated on trying to make it up the stairs without making too much noise, as to not alert whoever it was to my presence. But I forgot about the loose floorboards at the top of the stairs. It made a noise similar to a balloon popping, and I let out a yell before I could stop myself. All at once the voice stopped, and I felt a rush of cold air that raced every hair of my body. Fight or flight kicked in, and I rushed into the room, ready to fight whoever was disturbing my child. But there was no one there. My daughter sat in her bed, looking at me with a startled look on her face. I most likely scared her, rushing into the room like that, but I was more worried about where the woman has gone. I searched every inch of her room and double-checked that her window, as well as the one on the landing, were still locked, but found nothing out of place. Walking back into the room, I laid her back down, gave her another good-night kiss, and made my way back downstairs, making a mental note to call my doctor in the morning to discuss the hallucinations that I was evidently having. I didn't settle into bed until I heard soft snoring coming from the monitor, indicating that she had finally fallen asleep. I snuggled into my bed and turned on the TV to provide a little break in the silence before drifting off to sleep. Charles woke me up an hour or so later, as he came in and asked why I left the radio on upstairs. Still not fully awake, I asked him what he was talking about as I pointed at the radio sitting on my desk across the room. I had brought it down earlier to fix the broken antenna and not taking it back upstairs. I was snapped the rest of the way awake when he asked, "Then who is up there singing to Lila?" I shot out of bed and bottled up the stairs, not bothering with trying to be quiet, with my confused husband hot on my heels. I reached the room and threw the light on, fully expecting to be greeted by the sight of some crazy woman who had broken in, only to realize the room was empty, save for my sleeping daughter who had begun to stir from all the commotion. We backed out to the room slowly, shutting the light off as we went and made our way back downstairs, both scratching our heads, trying to figure out what in the hell was going on. I told him about what had happened earlier and about the fact that I had honestly dismissed it as a side effect of the lithium. He decided he wasn't sleeping that night and told me to get some rest, knowing how exhausted I had been lately. He woke me up a few hours later, gently nudging my shoulder and telling me not to freak out and to just listen. Coming from the monitor was the same voice as earlier, but more audible this time. The woman wasn't talking this time though. She was singing. The song that was coming from upstairs was the same song that I sang to Lila every night. A song that was not a lullaby. A song that only my husband and daughter had even heard me sing to her. It was then that I realized that Charles was crying, but smiling at the same time. I looked at him and asked if he was okay. That's Grandma's voice, he replied, barely above a whisper. His grandmother had practically raised him since the day he was born. She had even taken him home from the hospital when it was determined that his mother's mental state at the time would not allow him to properly care for him. And his father couldn't take care of him and her at the same time as holding down a full-time job. Charles grew up spending most of his time at his grandmother's house, as his mother's mental health fluctuated widely. Things went on like that until his grandmother fell ill and ultimately passed away from pneumonia when he was 11, at which point Charles was forced to live with his parents full-time and take up the responsibility of taking care of his two younger sisters when his father was at work and as his mother's mental state bounced back and forth. Shortly after all, his mother suffered a major breakdown and had his father arrested for something that she had apparently convinced herself he had done. He stayed in jail for a while for domestic violence until he could convince a judge that her claims were false. In this short time, she had been committed due to her erratic behavior, and my husband and his sisters had been placed in the care of the state. By the time his father was released from jail, he was faced with an eviction notice, a pink slip from his employer, his wife in an institution, and his children out of his reach. This led to his father diving death first into a bottle of Jack instead of trying to straighten everything out, leaving his children to be adopted to a religious zealot who was the living embodiment of every evil stepmother Disney could think of. Charles' grandmother was quite possibly the only bit of good he had in his childhood. He had always said that on his darkest days he could feel her there with him, urging him forward and strengthening him. We sat there, listening to her singing till the song was finished and everything fell silent. The only sound that could be heard was the soft rhythmic breathing coming from Lila. Just as we thought it was over, we heard one last thing came from the voice in our daughter's room. "I love you, and I'm so very proud of you, Charlie." My crying husband then bounded up the stairs, taking them two at a time in an effort to catch a fleeting glimpse at his grandmother's spirit, only to once again be met with an empty room. I heard him sniffle slightly and then whisper, "I love you too, Grandma," before sighing heavily and making his way back down the stairs to our room. I held him as he cried himself to sleep as the sun started to peek through the windows. That night was the only time she allowed us to hear her, but we still feel her presence from time to time, when times get rough, and he has even felt a slight tap on the back of his head after he called me a name, as if she was trying to tell him to straighten up. My daughter understandably has no memory of any of this due to her being so young. She, however, did recognize Charles' grandmother when she was shown a picture and has talked about remembering her visits when she was younger, even though she passed away long before Lila was even thought of.
I am a 34-year-old male living in Finland, and these events I'm going to tell you took place in 1987. I was only 5 years old at the time. I lived in a row house in a municipality called Numijärvi, near Helsinki. This house had 2 floors. The bedroom was located upstairs and the living room downstairs. Sometimes, in fact, quite often, I happened to wake up at night, and I could see the radiator of the room on the wall as a white cow. A cow of pure white, which sometimes looked like it would have moved towards me, and which varied the position from standing to a recovering and so on. The cow radiator seemed to kind of have a spruce forest in its background. Once, when someone for some reason turned the lights on in the room, I saw the radiator again, just as a normal home appliance. But as soon as the lights went out, it would show itself again as a cow, which was very strange. In the living room, there was a Lundia shelf level, with a Solora television set, and a Fisherman Betaman VCR on the right-hand side, and then a sharp turntable. At times I used to sleep with my mother in the living room. The digital clock of the videotape recorder, whose colour was green, shone so brightly in the darkness of night that it interfered with sleep, especially with my mother. So she came up with an idea to put a tabloid newspaper on the VCR to cover the clock. When I happened to wake during the night there, in the living room, I could see how the tabloid was moving. Sometimes it moved as if airstream would have come and swung over it, and other times it would move horizontally. Despite the fact, the clock didn't appear. Once, when my mother went to the bathroom at night, she switched the kitchen extractor fan light on. The kitchen was located next to the living room. The tabloid newspaper on the VCR showed up in my eyes as normal, and when the light was switched off, it continued moving again, completely on the loose.
My uncle committed suicide in early 2006. He'd had a history of depression and drug use. So one night, he packed up all his belongings, put them in his car, and drove out to a long stretch of road near the woods behind the house he and his wife lived in, and fell asleep with the engine running. My uncle had an ex-wife who was a money-hungry bitch. It apparently wasn't good enough that my uncle paid generous amounts of child support to her on a regular basis, but she also constantly used their daughter as a pawn to get more money out of my uncle by having the daughter ask for money to go out with friends and then giving it to her mother. So it came as no surprise that upon hearing my uncle had died, the ex-wife only wanted to know if there was any money coming to their daughter. Now, everything that happens next is purely from memory, from something that my mother told me had happened, as recounted to her by the woman my uncle was married to when he died. So my uncle's wife, now a widow, had gone to sleep in their house by herself one night about a week after the funeral. Up till this point, it was assumed my uncle had not left a will, as no one could find where it was located. But this particular night, his wife fell asleep and had a dream where she was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, and while she was looking into, my uncle appeared in the mirror, looking as though he was standing directly behind her. He told her in the dream that she would find the money in his will, wrapped in a plastic inside a small cardboard box which was buried in the backyard underneath the tree. The next morning, my uncle's wife went outside and started digging under the tree. It only took her a few minutes to find the box my uncle had told her about in the dream, and when she opened it up, there was my uncle's will and a couple of fat stacks of cash. It was later that my uncle's wife would tell us the only reason she didn't dismiss the dream was that there'd been an incident the day after my uncle's funeral. She'd been standing in the kitchen washing up dishes when she suddenly glanced up to look out the window that faced the backyard and the shed outside. She said she saw my uncle's face peering out of the window of the shed, and then heard his voice softly say, "It's all going to be okay, Ben," which was my uncle's nickname for her, and that's why she knew to follow my uncle's instructions in the dream she would later have.
I was 17 at the time, and always believed in the paranormal, but never really had a true experience until one night that I vividly remember till this day. So one night I was sleeping in my upstairs room, looking like usual, and for some reason I woke up at around 3 or 4 in the morning, which wasn't that unusual, but this night was very odd. When I woke up, the entire room was lit like a soft light, kinda grey, which was odd because the room was always pitch and had no street lights or night lights to produce any ambient light. So I really didn't think anything about it until I saw something that looked like a woman figure standing down the end of my hallway. At first I thought I was dreaming, but I wasn't. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt too real to be anything like that. I continued to stare at the figure down the hall, thinking it was my mum, but thought to myself, why would she be up at this time of hour? When I tried to call out, I couldn't. I was just frozen, not able to move nor speak. Now this is where it starts getting strange. At this time, I'm still staring at this figure, and it starts moving closer to me. It started moving floor by foot, like it was skipping through time, like in a panel-style movement. The odd thing is I wasn't afraid when I should have been scared shitless because of some strange personal entity coming slowly towards me. It finally reaches my doorway and just casually walks to the foot of my bed and stands there. The figure is dressed all in white, looked almost like a wedding dress, and I couldn't see its face as it was covered by a veil, but I knew it was a woman, just looking at the features. I was still not afraid, but I did feel this deep sorrow and sadness coming over it. It was only inches away from me at this point, and I just remember crying for no reason. I never cry. It was like I was feeling what it felt. This whole ordeal lasted about 10 minutes, and then it slowly just walked out of the room and vanished down the hallway. I then passed out and woke up later in the morning. At this point, I was scared shitless and couldn't understand what I had just experienced. I call her the woman in white. I never saw her again after that, and from that day I get goosebumps just thinking about this.
It's important to note that I never had the chance to meet my maternal grandfather. He died 3 years before I was born. In this personal account, I was about 10 years old when this incident occurred back in the early 2000s. My father and brother had gone away for the weekend due to work commitments, leaving myself and my mother at home. Since my bedroom and my parents' bedroom are at the opposite ends of our 2-story house, my mother suggested she'd feel better sleeping downstairs with me, so we stayed in my brother's bedroom as he had a larger bed at the time. It's worth noting that my brother's bedroom had also belonged to my parents when they had first purchased the house. Anyway, I don't remember much of actually going to sleep that night. All I know is that all of a sudden I was awoke in the middle of the night. I slowly opened my eyes. The room was dark with only a small amount of light coming from the outside streetlights, and I was facing my mother who was sleeping with her back to me. Then my eyes focused, and I could suddenly make out the blurry shape of what looked like a man, standing next to the bed. It was almost like he was made up of a fine mist. His body was see-through, and seemed to ripple like waves. There was also a low rumbling in the room, which I think is what woke me up suddenly. The noise now reminds me of the low rumble sound you hear in the first Paranormal Activity movie whenever anything happens. The man's head was tilted downstairs slightly to look at me, and he was smiling. It was a friendly smile, and I remember feeling very relaxed and at peace, so much so that I could actually close my eyes and went back to sleep. Like I said earlier, I'd never met my grandfather, but I just knew it must have been him. The next morning I told my mother what I've seen. It felt like I had stared at this figure for a full minute, and during that time my mother had never woken up. When I described to her what the figure had been wearing when I had seen him, my mother looked surprised and said, "That was the chute your grandfather was buried in."
After my uncle committed suicide in 2006, a couple of strange things began happening around the house. There were the typical haunting style things, like my brother insisting his stereo would turn up by itself when he was listening to music, or the time that his TV turned off all by itself. But I figured that all of it could have been chalked up to electronic interference. This particular incident, however, was just plain weird. For background, it should be noted that my uncle stayed with us about 15 years prior to his suicide. This was during the height of his drug abuse, and he slept on our couch for a few months before my mother decided to kick him out, as she had 3 young children to worry about at the time. So back to present day 2006, and my brother's friend, called John, is hanging out at our house. He was always a fairly sensitive and spiritual kind of guy, and he actually had no prior knowledge of my uncle's death. So John is sitting on the couch talking to me and my brother when he suddenly stops and says that he can feel a presence in the room. My brother and I kind of laugh at this because this is your typical John, always sensing something. But he stuns us and said, "Your uncle's sitting next to me, and he says hello." My brother and I were pretty shocked because, like I said, John had no prior knowledge of my uncle's death. Not only that, was the exact same spot that my uncle had slept on 15 years prior when he started staying with us. There is absolutely no way John could have known any of that, because it wasn't something that my brother had ever mentioned to him. Now fast forward a few years, another strange incident occurred one night when I was heading to bed. I had just turned out the light to the kitchen, and had started walking down the long hallway that leads to my bedroom. I had literally just shut my door when I hear my name being whispered. I stand there not knowing what to do. The whisper had caught me off guard because it sounded exactly like my uncle's voice. I shake it off, thinking I'm probably imagining things and go to bed. A few days later, for whatever reason, I can't remember, I tell my mother that I thought I had heard my name being whispered, and that it sounded like my uncle. You know what she tells me next? She had actually been home one day the week before, and was in the kitchen making lunch for her and my dad, when she hears her name being called. Then she calls out to my dad, who was in the next room, and asks what he wants. He said he hadn't called out to her, and he also hadn't heard her name being called. But then he tells my mum, "Oh, you want to know something funny? I was out in the garage one day last week when no one was around, and I heard my name being called." Then Dad says that he called out and didn't hear anyone, so he went back to working on his bike, thinking nothing of it, and thought that he was just hearing things. The voice we had all heard sounded exactly like my uncle's voice. It's definitely a strange coincidence that we all heard our names being called, when we all aren't the kind of people who just hear things, and in such a short space of time with no knowledge of either event. And this was during a time when none of us had been thinking about my uncle to have the suggestion put into our heads. It was a little creepy at the time, but thinking back on it now, it's kind of nice to think that my uncle might still be around watching over us, and that it may have been his way of playing a prank on us, since he definitely had that kind of weird sense of humour when he was alive.
Not home alone, but scared the hell out of me nonetheless. Was lying on the couch at about 1 a.m. with my girlfriend, watching The Village. mildly scary movie for those who haven't seen it. We've just gotten past the jump scare scene when I see in my peripheral vision a flashlight outside turn on then immediately off, followed by the sound of our back door shutting. I look at my girlfriend and she nods to say she heard it too. Okay, time to soil my pants. I get up slowly, sneak to the doorway and poke my head into the kitchen where our back door is. The only light in the kitchen is from the TV in the lounge, so I couldn't really see anything. I hunched down and creep into the kitchen, around the fridge to the left, and immediately stop. Frozen. All I can see is the silhouette of a tall, thin man figure, with its back towards me, facing the corner behind the dining table. It's totally still, not making a sound. What the hell am I supposed to do? I reckon I was frozen there for a whole minute, just staring at the figure. Eventually I look back at the doorway to the lounge to see if my girlfriend has come into the kitchen, but she must have stayed on the couch. When I turn back to the figure, it's still there, but has turned around and is facing me now. I can see the silhouette and two dim unblinking eyes. I scream and run into the lounge room, grab my girlfriend by the arm and pull her into my bedroom. I've never moved so quickly in my life. We lock the door and jump behind the bed. I'm hyperventilating while my girlfriend is loudly asking me what the hell is going on. I keep telling her to shh, and finally she does. We just sat there, listening for any sounds of movement for maybe about 10 minutes. I pulled out my cell and called 911 once I calmed down, saying that we had a break-in and I wasn't sure if he was armed. 5 minutes later, there's a knock on our front door, which is luckily across the corridor from my bedroom door, so I quickly dash out of my bedroom and out of the front door hand in hand with my girlfriend. And there's nobody outside. We look around a bit and call out, expecting the cops to come around the corner or something, but there's just nothing. I lose my nerve, run back inside and into my bedroom again. An hour later the cops showed up and shouted at us from the front door since we weren't opening it. Searched our house and found nothing. To this day, I have no idea what the heck happened that night.
Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Angeliki for not only sharing her artistic talents with us, but also for helping me narrate these stories, as well as to all the subscribers who submitted their stories for us to hear today. As many of you may know, my artist Angeliki has just started a narration channel too, so if you enjoyed her narration, please be sure to click the link on screen now or in the description to check her out. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel too though, drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts, as it always helps with that pesky algorithm. But anyway, for now guys I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you over on Creaks and Peaks.